Hi there, everyone, and welcome to our second set of our webinar series. I am Julia Mosconi. I work for Indigenous Education Incorporated. We're very excited to have you here with us today as we welcome Jay Rosner from the Princeton Review. And today he will be talking to you about the GRE and the best ways to prep for that test. Jay, I'll hand it on over to you. You're going to have to unmute your microphone.
There, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you are all set to go.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, welcome to the webinar. I'm going to try to give you about 45 to 50 minutes of the best material that I can come up with to help you specifically on the GRE. As you know, it's an important test for graduate school admissions, and the mantra is to get your best GRE score. So let's dive in. The title I have here is Unmasking the GRE. I want to make it as clear as possible to you what you need to do to get your best score. For those of you who were on the webinar with us last week, I want to quickly review the five or six most important slides that I covered that night. And the first one is my opinion of what the GRE actually measures. Does it measure how intelligent you are? In my opinion, I said no, if you recall. Does it measure how well you'll do in graduate or professional school? In this case, graduate school. And I said no, and I explained how it helps a little bit in predicting first-year GPA in graduate school. And that's something, it's just not very much. And so there's a disconnect between what the GRE shows and how well you will do in graduate school. Does the GRE measure how good you are at the GRE? And the answer is yes. That's what it measures. That's all it measures, in my opinion. So if you have a great GRE score, it means you're good at the GRE. And if you don't, you can take steps to improve your score. Another slide that I had some survey questions, and is it possible to pop up the polling question at this point?
Yeah, Milani is popping that up right now.
Great.
And so if all the attendees would go ahead and just kind of click what their what you most relate to in this poll, and I will report back to Jay when we get some people answering it.
Thank you.
As of right now, we have 100% college graduates.
Oh, okay.
There we go. We've got one college freshman or sophomore, and got some more coming in. Give it another few seconds and I'll see what we've got. All right, so we're looking at right now, 1/3 of our audience is a college freshman or sophomore, another third is a college senior, and the other third is a college graduates.
Thank you. I think I have another polling question that I'd like you to pop. Yeah, if you can pop up the second one, please.
All right, just hang tight. Here we go. Have you taken an official grad test? Go ahead and report. We'll give you a little bit on that, and I'll report back. Give it about 10 more seconds. All right now we're looking at about 100% have not taken any official grad tests.
Good, that's helpful for me to know. And actually, I think, yes, if you wouldn't mind popping up the third question. Sorry that I have 3 in a row here, but these are good things to deal with right at the beginning. Do we have the
yeah,
third?
Yeah, Milani's working on it right now.
Okay.
All right, so right now we're looking at about half are concerned about pre-calc on the GRE math test and half are not.
Okay. Well, I have good news for all of you, and let me continue. Thanks for the polling help. There is no pre-calc on the GRE. And so one of the things, so it was a little bit of a trick question, but it illustrates the point, because I always have people in any audience to which I do this presentation, I always have people concerned about pre-calc on the GRE because they don't know what's on the GRE. And once you find out what's on the GRE, you won't be concerned about pre-calc because there is no pre-calc on the GRE. It's a way for me to show you that there might be things you should be concerned about that are on the GRE, but please don't be concerned about things that are not on the GRE. And one of the ways you find out about what's on the GRE is you do preparation and you prepare intensively to get your best score. And then you find out what's on the test. So I want to relieve the concerns of at least half of you. There is no pre-calc on the GRE. The math on the GRE is arithmetic, algebra, and geometry. And there might be an algebra 2 question or two, maybe 1 or 2 questions in some other area of math, but 95% plus of the questions are arithmetic, algebra, and geometry. There are charts and graphs. Questions are in various formats, but there is no calculus, there is no pre-calculus, there isn't even any trigonometry. It's pretty much the math you learned through sophomore year in high school. So I hope that alleviates some of your concerns. Let me just talk about affirmative action and Indian students for a moment. You may not know it, and I'm an affirmative action advocate. If you don't know it, I think it's important for you to know that affirmative action is used by universities in 42 states in the United States. There are state universities in 8 states that are unable to use affirmative action because something happened in their state, either a ballot initiative or some other action was taken where their state universities can't use affirmative action. And how this plays out for Native students, if you didn't know, is Native students get a very small break through affirmative action. That is, a university can take a Native American student with a slightly lower score or a slightly lower grade point average through using affirmative action. The key word here is slightly. These are not, unfortunately, large breaks. These are small breaks. And so in terms of a test score, a Native student should want to get his or her best test score so that perhaps even there's no break necessary to accept that student. You want to supply graduate admissions offices with your best possible score so you have the best possible outcome. And I thought that that's just worth mentioning because there are some students who are a little confused about how that works. Sometimes people hear that, oh, affirmative action is a huge break, a huge advantage for Native students, for other and underrepresented minority students. It's not. It's typically a very small adjustment that's made in your favor in your application. And I have the word Becky here because I think this is a pretty humorous story. The white female student at the University of Texas who sued the University of Texas, claiming that she was discriminated against because she was white. That was the Fisher suit, which was just decided a couple months ago by the Supreme Court, where they said affirmative action is fine and universities can use affirmative action. It was under challenge. Abigail Fisher, the white student who sued, had a chance to get into the University of Texas if she finished in the top 10% of her high school class, which she didn't. Her grades were not in the top 10%. She had a second chance through another mechanism, and she didn't get admitted that way. And so, given that she had a chance to get into the university and didn't get good enough grades to do that, in order to kind of make fun of her a little bit for bringing a claim that she was discriminated against because she was white, which is kind of a ridiculous claim on its face to begin with, there was a little hashtag started, Becky with the bad grades. And so now this student has to go on the rest of her life being referred to as Becky with the bad grades, even you know, because she could have gotten better grades and wouldn't have had a complaint. And it's, I think, kind of deserving that she's stuck with that nickname. I thought that was kind of humorous and deserved. All right, we're going to get into GRE Prep. Again, you saw this if you were here last week. This is the single most important slide. This is just a little review, 2 to 3 hours a day, 5 to 6 days per week, 7 to 8 weeks, 4 to 5 practice tests. You all should know that. You saw you saw my friend Frank's wonderful medicine wheel that he's given me permission to use. And you might recall that Frank said to me that I really should emphasize whenever I'm presenting this to students that seeking balance is what his tribe considers to be of ultimate importance here. That's why it's on the top. But it does refer to the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual shape that you should get into, your best shape in all of those domains to get your best GRE score. And yet another little piece of review, my test prep goal PACES, which you recall, oops, let me put it back on. if you can honestly say you had a good preparation plan, you acted on your plan, you implemented your plan, you're confident and calm, you're energized and you're secure, you feel safe and secure. If you can honestly say that going into the test, you're set for your best score. And what you have to pay attention to, since you all have the plan, is you need to act on your plan, you need to get energized and get in your best condition in those domains, and you need to have a backup test date indicated for yourself. Those are the things you have to do to go into the official test and be ready to get your best score. So that concludes the little review. I wanted to go over those just to re-emphasize them because I think they are the most important slides that I can show you. Now we'll get into some GRE specifics. This is the breakdown of the GRE test. The first sections, it says the analytical writing section will always be first, and the other sections can appear in any order. And you can see there are 2 analytical writing tasks. It's an issue task for which you have 45 minutes and an argument task for which you have 30 minutes. Now, these writing tasks are essays that you type. It should say analytical typing, but it doesn't. It says analytical writing. And you basically type an essay. Now, there's a couple of things to know about the essay. Number one, it is the least important section of the GRE. The verbal score, your verbal score and your quant score are the most important scores on the GRE. You get an analytical writing score, and I'll discuss that in a moment. It's the least important score on the GRE for virtually all graduate schools. And if you want to check, you can call a graduate school department to which you're interested in applying, and you can ask them, how important is the analytical writing score on the GRE to your admissions process? And most of them will tell you, well, the verbal and the quantitative scores are the more important scores to us. Now, what that means is you don't want to blow off analytical writing. You want to do do 2 reasonably good essays. You don't want that to drag down your application. On the other hand, you want to spend 90% of your prep time, perhaps 95% of your prep time on the verbal and quant sections, and only a small portion of your prep time on the analytical writing section. There's a formula. The good test prep books and courses will teach you the formula for analytical writing. You learn the formula. You write an essay according to the formula. It looks reasonably good. That's what you want. That's what you need. What you really want to do is emphasize and prepare for the verbal and the quant sections. Now, you can see there are 2 verbal sections, 20 questions per section, 30 minutes per section, and 2 quant sections. Quant is mathematics. Sometimes I'll refer to it as math. There are 2 sections, 20 questions per section, 35 minutes per section. Then there are 4 what I call bubble sections, because instead of like on the old SAT and ACT where you would bubble in with a number 2 pencil, darken a bubble, you kind of click on a bubble on the screen for the GRE. And all of you can see that and experience that by just going online to any number of sites and taking a practice GRE. You'll see how that works. So you'll have 2 verbal sections, you'll have 2 math sections, but you will have a 5th section. And that section will be an additional verbal or an additional quant section. And that section is unscored. We call it the variable section or the experimental section. And that section is used by the test company to test new questions. And you don't know which of those 5 sections is unscored. So you have to do all the sections as if they're scored. And at the end of the test, you will have had either 3 verbal sections or 3 quant sections. And so you'll know at the end of the test which kind of variable section you had, which kind of unscored section you had, but you won't know which section it actually was. So that's the way that works. There's another section here called the research section. I've talked to hundreds of students. None of the students I've ever talked to have ever had a research section. It's a section where they tell you it's not scored. So if you're a rare student who gets that section, just, you know, do on it whatever you like. But what everyone will get is an unscored section. It'll be a verbal or quant section, and you won't know which one it is. Okay? So the GRE was revised in 2011, 5 years ago. So if you come up to somebody or someone says to you, oh, I took the GRE 10 years ago, let me tell you about it. They're telling you about a different test. I wouldn't spend a lot of time listening to them about that test unless you just want to be courteous. You're not going to pick up a lot of information that would be relevant to what you're facing now. So the test was revised, it was changed. Some of the changes are moderately significant. And another cautionary instruction is be sure you're using GRE test prep materials for the revised test. Please don't use test prep materials for the GRE before 2011. You're preparing for a different test that's no longer being given. And you may say to yourself, God, who would be dumb enough to do that? Well, people who don't know that the tests change do it all the time. So be aware that you want to use relatively new test prep materials. Make sure you're preparing for the revised test. They changed GRE scoring. Now the score range is from 130 to 170 on verbal and 130 to 170 on quant in 1-point increments. 130 is the lowest score, 170 is the highest score, 150 is the national average score, right about in the middle. Maybe the national average is 151. It's right in there. So that score range may look a little weird to you, but it's simply the old 200 to 800 score range, which used to exist on the GRE, which still exists on the SAT. Only they dropped the zeros off the end, put ones in front, and that would be 120 to 180, and they just shrank it a little, 130 to 170. So it acts like the old 200 to 800 score range, but it's set up a little different. So they just played around with the numbers a little bit to make it look unique. It's actually just like the old 200 to 800 score range, just a little narrowed to, say, 300 to 700, with ones in front and zeros dropped. Now that's in verbal and quant, and you get a 0 to 6 score on your analytic, the essays.
All right, looks like we lost Jay, unfortunately. So we'll just kind of go back through and do our best to review what Jay's been saying. So let me just quick screen share my screen right now. All right. So we'll go back and we will start right about here. So like Jay was saying, there's multiple sections to the GRE, the analytical writing, and then the analytical verbal, the verbal and the quant. So we kind of go through these sections again. I think it'll be a good opportunity for all of you to take notes if you feel need. And remember that at the end of these webinars, there will be time for question and answers with Jay. All other questions regarding the scholarship or Indigenous Education Incorporated can be directed towards our website or our email at scholarships@cobellscholar.org. So, like Jay was saying, he wants the minimum, or he suggests, a minimum of 2 to 3 hours per day of high quality practice of GRE test preps. And that would be 5 to 6 days per week. So just a couple of times out of your day, just sit down, kind of look at what you're doing, and that's what Jay is suggesting. There we go. And he says he suggests starting up to 7 to 8 weeks before the test. But kind of like we talked about last week, it's not recommended to be doing test prep the night before. Just like with any other exam, cramming will not help you study for these kind of exams. Starting to study as early as possible is most advisable. He also suggests 4 to 5 practice tests, but not more than 1 per week. So like he said, and also making sure that all of your materials are from after 2011 when they revamped their process. And also like the example Jay gave last week, going through thinking of it as a rehearsal, as training for your favorite sport, as anything else you can think of that can kind of give you some sort of incentive to do more than average on your studying.
Am I back on?
You are, Jay. Welcome back.
Oh, great. Where did I go off? Was I talking about the GRE breakdown on this slide or the next slide?
You were over here on the GRE breakdown talking about verbal and math and quant.
Okay, excellent. Well, let me pick up from there, and I'm sorry that I dropped off, folks. So there are 2 verbal sections and 2 quant sections, and those are the sections that yield the 2 important scores that I'll talk about on the next slide. There's a 5th section that everyone taking the GRE will get, and that's an unscored section. The unscored section looks exactly like a verbal section or exactly like a quant section. You won't know which section is unscored, so you have to do all the sections as if they're scored. So you'll have 5 sections, 2 verbal, 2 quant, and an additional either verbal or quant, which is unscored. The test company is using that section to experiment with new questions. That's why we call it the experimental section sometimes, or the variable section. They're using it to try out new questions. And there's another section called the research section, which no student I've ever spoken to has ever gotten, so it's very rare. And that's a section which rarely a student will get, where they tell you that it's not scored. And so you can do with that whatever you wish. But you know, most students won't get that. Every student will get 2 verbal, 2 quant, and then a 5th section that's either verbal or quant that's unscored, and you won't know which section that is. Let's go to the couple of elements of the GRE. The GRE was revised in 2011. What that means is some of the question types were changed. So if somebody comes up to you and says, oh, I took the GRE in 2005, let me tell you about it. They're telling you about a different test. So be careful about information that you get about the GRE. Make sure it's on the new revised test. Please make sure that any study materials you are using are applied to the new revised GRE that's been in effect since 2011. So basically, you want to use materials that were published within the last 5 years. Be very careful about that. You don't want to be studying for some other test. Now, the GRE scores range from 130 to 170 in 1-point increments on verbal and quant. And so those become the important scores. And there's a 0 to 6 score on analytic. We're on the GRE slide with the GRE score range 130 to 170. 0 to 6 on analytic is a score that you do get on the essays, but it's the least important score. Now, next is just a statement that the GRE verbal and math or quant sections exist on the test, but there's no science section. So a question for you: how much harder is GRE math than SAT or ACT math? Can we pull up a polling question on that? Is that possible?
Of course.
Okay.
Lonnie will get that all squared away, and we can get those responses back.
Now, while you're doing that, I'm going to try to screen share so that I can use my PowerPoint again, if that's okay.
Why don't we try to stick to, I can advance the slides for you just so we don't lose it again.
Okay.
As of right now, we're getting 100% as I'm not sure or don't know how much harder GRE math is than SAT/ACTs.
Okay. Well, let me clarify for you because it's an interesting concept. And the concept is that GRE math is actually a little easier than SAT or ACT math. Now, you may say, how can that be? It's a graduate school admissions test. How can GRE math be a little easier than SAT or ACT math? And the answer is most college students have not had math for for years. And if GRE math were harder than SAT or ACT math, they would bomb. So one of the fortunate aspects of your experience is that you get to take a math test that's slightly easier than SAT or ACT math. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy. It's challenging because most of you haven't seen math in or a math course in several years. So the watchword is GRE math requires real preparation. You have to typically get your math rust washed off. You have to refresh yourself on algebra, on geometry, on charts and graphs, on ratios and decimals and percents, those kinds of topics. And it's challenging, but it's actually a little easier than SAT or ACT math. So hopefully thinking about that will inspire you to work hard on the quant side of GRE and get a good score. Now, on the next slide, I have one great GRE test-taking technique. And this is a test completion question. And you can pull up the whole slide here, which includes a question and 5 answer choices, A, B, C, D, and E. Now, notice you have, I'm going to teach you a GRE test-taking technique, but I am not showing you any words. Why not? And you might be thinking, boy, if I can crack the code here, I can figure out the answer to this. There's no code. I just let my fingers go wild, typing X's. I wanted to get 24 words because you'll see why in a moment. And I didn't put words in there because you'd read the words and you wouldn't be listening to me and focusing on the structure of this question, because the technique, the great test-taking technique, this is my favorite test-taking technique. The great technique won't be as obvious to you if there were words there, because this technique solely relies on the structure of the question. So again, this is a text completion question. It's like an SAT sentence completion question. Those of you who took the SAT might remember that. And the technique that I'm going to explain to you is counterintuitive. That means your intuition would lead you in one direction, would lead you typically in the wrong direction answering this question. And a counterintuitive method, a method that doesn't sort of seem to make sense on its surface, is actually the better method here. So let me first start by explaining to you how most students do this question, because most students will do it in an inefficient and ineffective way. The way most students would do this question is they would read the question, 24 words, and plug in answer choice A while they're reading it. So they'll read 25 words. And then they'll read the sentence again, plug in B. So they're reading 50 words. Read it, plug in C, 75 words. Read it, plug in D, 100 words. Read it, plug in E, 125 words. Most students will read 125 words to try to answer this question. I don't do that. I use a different method. I use a method that involves reading 35 words. So listen to this. In a tightly timed test, you have a choice on a question like this to use a method that requires you to read 125 words or a method that requires you to read 35 words. It's your choice. But remember, the quicker you can get through this question and the quicker you can get a correct answer, the higher your score is going to be. So it would make sense that you would be interested in learning the method that involves only reading 35 words. Are you interested? I hope so. I'll show you. If you're not interested, that's okay. You can read 125 words. But for those of you interested in reading 35 words, here's the method. The method involves, first of all, picking a word, picking my own word to fill in the blank, but I don't want to be influenced by the 5 answer choices. I want to read the sentence and think carefully and quickly and pick my word that I think best fits in the sentence. And I don't want to be influenced by the answer choices. So I can do something. I can say, eyes, don't look at the answer choices. What do my eyes do? Well, I don't know about your eyes. My eyes look at the answer choices. So I have to actually physically cover them with my hand. And when I took the GRE back in 2011, I took the new test as soon as it was out, see what it was about. On a question like this, I'm righty, so I put my left hand up on the screen, and you can practice this at home. You're sitting there in front of your screen. If you're righty, put your left hand and cover the answer choices. That's what I did for all these questions. If you're lefty, put your right hand up and cover the answer choices, because I cover the answer choices with my left hand, and I wrote down on the scratch paper that they gave me at the official GRE, I wrote down my word that I was going to put in the blank. Then, and that only took, a few seconds. I read 25 words. I picked my word. I wrote it down. Then I took my hand down and I compared my word to A. So I read 25 words. I compared my word to A. 26, 27, I compared my word to B. 28, 29, my word to C. 30, 31, my word to D. 32, 33, my word to E. 34, 35. I read 35 words. Much faster, quicker, better. I get the correct answer more often. I get it much more quickly than I would if I read 125 words. I don't have 125 words.
All right, looks like we lost Jay again. So we can kind of go through using this question that he prompted us, our example. So if you want to follow along at home, kind of think about this question. So in the parks of the Arctic, the land grades into the land-fast ice so blank that you can walk off the coast and not know you are over the hidden sea. So in your head, or even on a piece of paper next to you, write down what you're thinking, what you think would fit best in that sentence. And then we can go through, kind of comment immediately. You can comment on the chat box off to the right, kind of what your thoughts are. So then we can go through, we can look at what the options are, which one might fit best. So like he was saying, you start from the beginning and you only read through the blank and you keep going with this to see which might fit best. You are, welcome back. All right, well, you're back and that's all that matters.
match. Gradually to slightly, that's a good match. So we have B and E. So the word gradually is not a great word. It's an okay word. It got us down to 2, and that's fine. As far as it goes with
Jake?
those, yes.
Hang on one second. We're getting some comments that they can't hear you.
Oh, wow. Okay. Let me try to unmute myself.
Okay, perfect. You're all set to go.
I'm good now?
You're good now.
Okay. So I was saying that the word gradually, if I use that and compared that to all the answer choices, B and E seem kind of okay, and if that's as far as I could get, that's fine. I just guess between one of those two, and I have a 50-50 shot of getting it correct. But there's a better word to plug in, and it's actually not even a word, and it doesn't even really fit. But let me show you this. So you don't always have to invent a word. The key words here to getting the answer is not know. And I can put in I can write in not, I would write down on my sheet not know. Into the landfast ice, so not know that you can walk off the coast and not know you're over the hidden sea. What matches with not know? Not permanently. Imperceptibly means you can't perceive it. You don't know. Irregularly, precariously, slightly don't fit with not know. So if you pick if through practice and your preparation you get good at picking the right word, the correct answer choice will just jump right out at you. Whereas if you don't pick a great word like I did the last time with gradually, it's not bad. You can get it down to 2, but you wanted to develop, and that would be fine, and you would guess between those 2. But by practicing this technique, you get very, very good at picking the best word, which gets you the best answer. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about how to best use practice GRE tests. You want to take practice tests about once every 10 days to 2 weeks. Why? Well, you want to do several things. The first thing that you want to do is to carefully analyze and work on your weaknesses and strengths between practice tests. Practice tests are like markers every 10 days to 2 weeks. It gives you a full test experience to see where your strengths and weaknesses are, how they've shifted maybe. Hopefully your weaknesses are getting strong because you're working on them. The next point here is it gives you regular exposure to building stamina. You practice pacing, you get a full test checkup. And the stamina is when you do a practice test, you're doing 3 hours of testing with only like 7 or 8 minutes of break. You build your stamina, you feel how it feels to be in the 3rd hour of a test and still trying to do your best. And so the practice tests help you check on stamina. That's very important. And to practice pacing. The next point, you can always afford to spend 5, 10, 15 seconds to refocus, to skip a question. Let me talk about refocusing techniques. Virtually all of us, and actually I mean all of us, when at a standardized test like the GRE, will get distracted at some point. You'll start thinking about something else. One of the ways this manifests itself, and I don't know if most of you have had this experience, is you read a question, you read a sentence, and you read it again, and you read it again, and you say to yourself, I've read this 3 times, it's just not going into my head at all. Which means likely you're unfocused, you're thinking about something else. The refocusing technique that I like, and you should develop your own, and this is one of the things you develop in practice tests is a refocusing technique. I take 5, 6, 7 seconds, take a deep breath, close my eyes, try to clear out my mind, and put myself in a position to refocus like a laser once I open my eyes. So one way to look at that is I'm wasting 7 or 8 seconds. That's not the right way to look at it. The way I look at it is I'm investing 7 or 8 seconds to refocus. And 95% of the time I do that, when I open my eyes, I read that sentence and it goes in. I've refocused. So you should think of some quiet sitting technique that you can use because you're at the official test and you can't stand up and do jumping jacks. You have to sit there and you have to be quiet. But some technique that you can use to help you refocus. I actually have a second refocusing technique that I use, and I'll tell it to you. But again, you need to develop your own, whatever works for you. I'm 6'4" with long legs that don't fit well in any chair that I'm in any testing center. So my legs are getting a little stiff and uncomfortable anyway at any test like this. So if my first technique just doesn't work, and it almost always works, but on the rare occasions that it doesn't, my second technique is I close my eyes and I stick my legs straight out and I tense them up until like it's a little uncomfortable. And so I'm thinking about how my legs are uncomfortable. I'm not thinking about the test. Again, 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds is all this takes. And then I relax my legs, put my feet down on the floor, open my eyes, and I'm usually refocused sufficiently that technique helps me plug right back in. So you should develop at least a primary refocusing technique, and if you like, a second refocusing technique. And you work these out on your practice tests so that when you're at the real test, you have a mechanism to quickly address a lack of focus or a distraction. Can I have the next? Okay, and a lot of people get hyper-focused on practice test scores when they take a practice test. That's not what's important. What's important is the number of correct and incorrect on the various question types. Particularly, you want to improve on the question types that you've been practicing on between practice tests. So we can go to the next. What are the first steps in beginning to think about taking the GRE? Well, we start this. If you're thinking about taking the GRE, you're not serious until you take a practice test under test conditions. So, and you want to score and analyze it. But when I'm talking to folks and they say, oh, well, I'm interested in taking the GRE. Have you taken a practice test? No. Well, you're not that interested. When you will show me your interest when you take a practice test. And then after you take a practice test, you score and analyze it. And you use the results to inform your decisions because you'll figure out your strengths, your weaknesses. You'll see if you get tired near the end, which means you need to be in better physical condition. And you need to develop a test prep plan that fits your needs. Now, GRE scores are good for 5 years. So those of you who are waiting to take the GRE or to prep for the GRE, I don't know why you're waiting. You should get right to it because your scores are good for 5 years. You have time to go and do other things and still use the scores. We can go to the next slide here. I use a lot of athletic analogies because people understand athletics and they don't understand testing. So let's say you have an important run coming up. You want to do both long-term and short-term prep for a run as you would for a test. And what both involved, and you heard me talk about last week for those of you on the webinar, the athletic analogies, the practice and training analogies for test prep. What you want is a training program in athletics to build your skills and strength and stamina. And as I mentioned, the test is a physical experience also. But some folks will say, oh, you don't have to do any short-term test prep. Either you know it or you don't know it. That's so sad because it's so wrong. It's like telling athletes, oh, you don't have to really do any practice or training in a week or two before your big game because you either know it or you don't. You either can do it or you can't do it. That's goofy. And it doesn't apply either to artistic performances, just like I said before. You want to peak your performance without burning out. More is not always better. You saw my video on that. You want to work hard, but don't obsess. And there are different approaches to, your 1 mile run or test prep. I happen to be a relaxed and laid back guy, but I turn into a test taking machine when I get into the test. Be proactive. Whatever proactivity you can draw out of your personality, if you can implement that in your test prep and in your prep, you're going to get a higher score because it's a tightly timed test where you have to be energetic and move quickly through the test. So being proactive helps you get a better score. We can go to the next slide. What is preparing intensively long term? Now, this is a concept if you have like 5, 6, or more than 6 months to prep. That's what I mean by long term. And here are some of the things that you can do. Next, you have to decide whether you need to do a reading review, a math review, or both. And for the reading review, what I suggest, and you might ask, well, how do I know whether I need a reading or a math review? Well, you take a practice test and you see how you do. And if you think you need a reading review after you take a practice test, if you think you need a long-term review, you can do daily practice. One of the things that I like is the New York Times editorials and op-eds, particularly the op-eds. The editorials can be long sometimes. The op-eds, and those are the articles or columns opposite the editorial page, tend to be a little longer than the average GRE reading comprehension passage in the verbal section, but they're at about the same level of difficulty with about the same vocabulary. And so practicing on them for 6 months, every day, half an hour, 45 minutes, where you really focus on reading quickly, good comprehension. You can explain what was in the article to somebody else. You're looking up the vocabulary words. That's a good way to build your strength of reading, but you need to do that pretty long term. That's like 6 months. The Sunday New York Times book review is one notch higher because it's written for a very literate audience, an audience which reads books, and you have longer articles. They're longer than GRE reading comp passages, but the vocabulary level is higher. You have the opinion of the author of the article. You have the opinion of the writer of the book that's being reviewed. It's got a complexity to it. So if you want to bump your game up a notch, you can use that source, even though the reading level is even a little higher than the GRE. And vocabulary, there's a good vocabulary book called Word Smart if you need vocabulary work to help your reading. Now, next on math there's an equivalent book called Math Smart, which I may or may not have mentioned last week. And that's a book that addresses arithmetic, fractions, decimals, percents, ratios, basic algebra, basic geometry, which you do long term because you do that. You don't need to do that for 6 months. You do that for maybe a month or two, but you do that before your intensive GRE prep, before your 8 weeks of GRE prep. And that's the point that I'm making there. We go to the next slide. Many things you can control and a few you can't. You can control a lot of stuff here, and you can put up the next few items. These are all things you can control. You can control lots about your work and family and friends. You obviously can't control everything, but you can control the time you spend with your friends while you're doing GRE prep, and hopefully you're minimizing that because you have GRE prep to do. All of these things you can control. What you can't control is which exact questions appear on the screen. So there's a lot you can control, and your success in test prep and your success on the test may be pretty significantly affected by how well you can control all these things that you can control. So focus on the things you can control and do your prep and put yourself in a position to respond well to the questions, because you don't know the content of those questions. Those are the things you can't control. We can go to the next slide. So a GRE prep course, if you happen to take a course, or if you do self-study, it's 7 to 8 weeks of cramming. Unlike college courses, you have to prep hard from day one. The next point, you can't cram a cram course. So if you think, oh, it's 7 to 8 weeks, so I'll start really slowly, 3, 4, 5 weeks, and then I'll kick it in the last 2, 3 weeks. It's not enough prep. You have to do 7 to 8 weeks of full prep. That's a cram course. You can't cram that. Your prep plan should make sense with good reasons for everything you do. If somebody says to you, you know, you should try this, if it sounds a little strange to you, you're not sure whether you do it, first thing you should say is, well, why should I do that? And often what someone will say to you is, oh, no, I just heard that that's a good thing to do. There should be a good reason to do it. You can always email me and ask me if you hear something that you're not sure about. Be careful about what people say. There's a lot of misinformation floating around, and sadly, misinformation is shared by people who actually are well-intentioned. They want to help you. They just don't know what they're telling you is wrong. So if you get some advice, you're not sure about whether to follow it or not, send me an email. There's my email. Say, Jay, I heard this, or Jay, somebody told me this, and I'll tell you, that's good advice, or sometimes that's good advice, sometimes that isn't. Here are the situations, or actually that's really wrong. And frankly, when people email me things that they've heard about the GRE, I'd say more than 50% of the time, I end up telling them, that's really wrong. That's bad advice. You should not do that. Now, I'm not saying all advice is bad advice. Just be careful. Everything you do in prep should make sense with good reasoning to support it. I have good reasoning for everything that I'm telling you here. So what have you heard about the GRE that you're not sure about? Sounds a little weird, etc. You can ask me that in the Q&A. Let's go to the next slide. We'll try to do 1 or 2 more slides quickly and then have a few minutes of questions and answers. Hopefully you're typing questions in on a chat box or question box that you have.
That's actually it, Jay. This is just our contact information.
Oh, okay.
So if you wanted to proctor some questions now, we did have one when you were talking about affirmative action.
Sure.
They're wondering if affirmative action is used on your score if you're notified.
I don't know what "if you're notified" means. Who notifies who about what? Can we get a clarification? Can we go to another question while maybe somebody clarifies that?
As of right now, I don't know if we have any other questions. So people send in your questions and Jay will be more than happy to answer them. Or if you have any, like Jay said in his last bullet point here, what have you heard about the GRE that you're not sure about or sounds weird, or what kind of myths can we bust here for you?
That's exactly it. There are a lot of myths floating around. Well, let me talk about affirmative action just for a moment. I don't know, as I said, who notifies who about what about affirmative action. I don't know what the person is thinking, and if they could clarify, I could maybe address it. But the way affirmative action works is it's in the methods that an admissions office uses to evaluate your application. So it's not as if you get a letter saying, dear Mr. So-and-so or Ms. So-and-so, we're using affirmative action to evaluate your application. The graduate division will use it or not, and not necessarily tell you. Now, there are graduate schools that are prohibited from using affirmative action, and those are the state universities and colleges in the 8 states that are prohibited from using affirmative action by their own state mechanisms. So those schools, and one example is California. The University of California system cannot use affirmative action. So the graduate schools of Berkeley and UCLA and UC San Diego and UC Santa Cruz and all the University of California schools cannot use affirmative action. So you know that they won't, you're notified that they won't be using affirmative action because they're prohibited by law from using it.
Sure.
But those are the exceptions to the rules, the rule in 42 states, and all private universities is they are permitted to use affirmative action, and a large percentage of the selective and competitive programs do use affirmative action. I hope that clarifies things.
Yeah, we got a clarification from her. You might have already answered, but she clarified if admissions or the scorers are applying a score adjustment per affirmative action, is the tester notified that their score has been adjusted?
No.
No. Okay.
I've never heard of that happening. With only one exception, it was on the undergraduate level. And it was kind of interesting. MIT added 50 points to females' math scores back in the 1990s because they wanted to, that was an affirmative action move trying to get more females in MIT. So they made that announcement. That was the only announcement that I've ever heard like that. And I've never heard of an individual being notified that affirmative action was being used. So I think that's responsive to the question.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
We do have another question. We have someone wondering if you need to have your GRE completed before you apply for grad school.
That depends on the grad program, and you'll have to go program by program and ask. Hopefully you're not leaving the GRE to the last minute because that would raise that question. You're better served getting the GRE and getting your score early. That will help you choose programs. That will help you see what programs might be a good fit for you. If the GRE is happening late in the game, some schools will allow you to apply and then have the GRE score come in a few weeks later. Of course, you're applying blind. You don't know what your GRE score is, and that's not a really good approach. Other schools will insist that they have the GRE score by their application deadline. So there's no, and I said schools, it's department by department. So you could be applying to the sociology department and the psychology department of the same university, and they may have different requirements, or they may have the same requirement. So the only answer to that question as to when they need to get the GRE score by, is it the application deadline, or will they wait a couple weeks after that? You have to ask each department that you're applying to what their policy is. They usually have it on their website in their application requirements. It typically says, we require that you submit a GRE score by our application deadline, or we require that you take the GRE and an administration by our application deadline, or something else. You need to go department by department to have that question answered accurately.
All right. Well, as of right now, we don't have any other questions. I don't know if there's any last minute remarks you've got, anything that you can think of, Jay, that's kind of, well, like you said, well-intentioned tips.
A well-intentioned, accurate tip.
Yeah, exactly.
Would be, all of my tips are well-intentioned, but they're helpful. I think the parting comment is make a note of my email address. And if you hear something along the way that you wonder about, send me an email and ask me if it's good advice or not. I think what folks need to focus on are the following things. If you're serious about taking the GRE, show me and show yourself, take a practice test. After you take the practice test, you'll see your strengths and weaknesses. You want to pick an 8-week period where you're going to do your prep. You want to figure out what prep method you're going to use. Are you going to do self-study with a book and doing a lot of questions on a computer? Are you going to try to take a classroom course? Are you going to try to take an online course? Are you going to try to take a live online course? Figure all that all out. Then do it and sign up for the test at the end of that 8-week prep period. If you find yourself saying, well, I might take the test later this fall, and then no, I'm going to take it in the spring, and then no, I'm going to take it next summer. You're in an avoidance cycle, and name it and deal with it. Unfortunately, I've talked to so many people who've been avoiding the GRE for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. It gets no easier if you push it back. Your goal should be to take a practice test within the next week or two. Why not? Even if you're thinking of taking the GRE a year from now, take a practice test within the next week or two. Score it, analyze it, see your strengths and weaknesses, and pick an 8-week period when you're going to do your prep, and then you'll take the test after that period. That's the only way to break an avoidance cycle, is to actually do it. And
would you recommend taking a practice test before you start any prep, just to see where you're at to begin?
Sure. Why not? Why not find out your strengths and weaknesses right away? Why be studying for a couple of weeks and wondering what your strengths and weaknesses are, or thinking that you know? And I've had so many people say, Jay, historically math has been my strength, but I get a higher verbal score on the GRE. That person didn't know until they took a practice test. And you won't know what your specific strengths and weaknesses are. Are you weak in algebra on algebra questions? Are you weak on chart and graph questions? You don't know until you take a practice test. So I think it's not a good idea to, if you spent a couple hours looking at the GRE before you took a practice test, that's fine. But if you're spending weeks in prep not knowing your strengths and weaknesses, you're kind of flying blind. That just does not make a lot of sense. It's not a good approach. Thanks for that question. That's a good question.
So we've got another question. Someone's asking, where can they take the practice test? So I would go a step further and ask, what are the best sources that you can take practice tests on?
There are plenty of sources for practice tests. Just Google GRE practice test, and there'll be a dozen sites that come up. PrincetonReview.com is one that I've used in the past, but there are plenty of sites. The site that actually you don't want to use, because it's the best practice tests, is the official GRE site. And you want to save, you get either, I don't remember, 2 or 3 practice tests on the official GRE site. Those are the 2 best practice tests because they're from the official test company. Save those for your last 2 practice tests in your preparation. Don't take those as one of your first practice tests. Take it on any other site, and just understand that the scoring rubrics on the others, the sites like PrincetonReview.com and Kaplan.com and major test prep companies have good practice tests with good score curves. They're not great. The score curves they're guessing at. So don't put a whole lot of weight on the score curve. As I said in the presentation, you want to put more weight and look more carefully on which question types are you getting correct, which ones are you getting wrong, which ones did you practice and are missing, for what reasons. You want to get into that level of detail, which takes time. You want to get way beyond the number, which is just a guess by the test prep company as to what, it's a good guess, but it's a guess as to what your score is.
All right. And then I guess another question that might be in the back of someone's head, where do you suggest to look for to actually take the test? So I know that if you could take it at your university or your college, but are there suggested places where you go to look and to schedule your test, and how far in advance do you suggest doing this?
Oh, great. You go on the GRE website and they list all the test locations. So you pick the one that's most convenient to you. That's pretty simple. Now, the earlier you do that, the more likely you're going to get your first choice, because if you wait till the last minute, and December is a terrible time to take the GRE because all the test prep places get filled because everybody's trying to get a GRE score in before January 1st deadlines. So, and that's typically only the really tight time of year to take the GRE. The earlier you register to take the official GRE at a specific test date and site, the more likely you're going to get your first choice, number one. You should do that. Remember, you're prepping for 8 weeks. You should pick your test date at least 12 weeks before, 3 months before you're planning to take the test. Why not? You're coming on your 8-week period for preparation. You know when that's going to end. You know when you want to take the test. Sign up for it then, get your first choice. In terms of which place is a better place to take the test, they're all roughly equivalent. You should likely choose just one that's located geographically convenient to where you live or live at school or wherever you're located.
Awesome. Well, unless we have any other questions, I think that just about wraps us up for our GRE test prep.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for those who are on the webinar tonight. Good night.
All right, everyone. Thanks again so much for your patience and for sticking with us for this GRE test prep. If you're here for the LSAT test prep, that will start in about 20 minutes, so just stay tuned. Our contact info is right in front of you. If you have any other questions, please direct them towards Jay. I'll pop that up one more time, jr@review.com. And like I said, stay tuned for the LSAT test prep, and we will be back with you in just a few minutes here. Thanks again.